folks. Thanks for joining us today. My name is Lynn Thomas. I'm the head of the Rare Book and Manuscript Library, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second in-person event for the semester. It's also my pleasure to read the land grant institution land acknowledgement. As a land grant institution, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign has a responsibility to acknowledge the historical context in which it exists. In order to remind ourselves and our community, we will begin this event with the following statement. We are currently on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Miami, Mascoutin, Odawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. It is necessary for us to acknowledge these Native nations and for us to work with them as we move forward as an institution. Over the next 150 years, we will be a vibrant community inclusive of all of our differences, with Native peoples at the core of our efforts. At this time, I'd like to welcome our guest speaker and introduce Dr. Kate Coker, who's going to introduce our speaker.
So many speakers. So it is my honor to introduce our special guest, Paul Needham. One of the cool things about working here is sometimes your library heroes will just be here and you get to just be cool about that. I have no cool, ask him. Paul has been an academic librarian since 1970, most recently of the Scheide Library at Princeton University, from which he retired in 2020. He is an internationally recognized expert on incunables and early modern print, and his resume includes just about every possible honor that our field offers. He has been a Guggenheim Fellow, he's been a gold medalist in the Bibliographical Society for his distinguished services and outstanding contributions to bibliographical study. His extensive research on early modern print includes close examination of the Mainz Catholicon, the subject of today's lecture. The RBML has recently acquired, through the generous support of Lionel and James Assessor, a copy of the second impression of this book, which will be on display in our reading room after the talk. We will be recording the lecture, and we will also have Q&A afterwards that will be moderated. Lastly, I do want to say, Paul, you have been a very real inspiration to me for the work that you have done championing the marginalized voices, particularly with regards to the case of the anthropodermic binding in Harvard. That is, of course, an ongoing controversy, and it means a lot that people like you are doing work so that justice is had. So with no more ado, please join me in giving Paul a very warm welcome.
Do we have our little reading lamp, or is that on its? Wait. Just a second, and we will start. Yeah, I wanted the room to be as dark as possible for the sake of the slides, but still with enough light that I can actually read my words. And let's see if this holds it in place. Yeah, well, maybe not. Let's try this. It'll just be a little awkward, but don't mind. Ladies and gentlemen, and anybody else who is in the room, it is a pleasure and an honor to speak to you about a man with a famous name, Johann Gutenberg, and about a book he printed, less famous, known as the Mainz Catholicon. The occasion is, as you just heard, Illinois' acquisition this year of a fine copy of the Catholicon through the generosity of James and Lionel Elsesser. And I hope by the time we finish, you'll agree that this book belongs in a top 10 list of the most important books ever printed. When I wrote this a little over a week ago, I thought I'd do a little thing about how the Gutenberg Bible is the Babe Ruth of printed books, and then what would the Catholicon be? Would it be the Ted Williams, or would it be the Willie Mays? And then October 17th came along, and there was the Dodgers-Brewers game, and Ohtani dominated as a pitcher, plus hit 3 home runs, and just suddenly everything sounded like, our old standards, we don't quite know where they are anymore. And then a friend of mine said, and yeah, what about the Negro League? What about Josh Gibson? What about? And I just suddenly thought, cool, Papa Bell. I thought, just drop the whole thing. So I can't compare it with any great baseball player anymore, but it would be right up there.
I'm going to try to increase your volume. Sorry.
Yeah.
Let me see if that looks.
Okay. Johann Gutenberg.
Let's get the back here.
Is that okay in the back?
Put the mic a little closer.
How was that? Is that better?
Yes, awesome.
Okay,
We're
okay.
very
I'll
high-tech
try and sort of hold on to that. Johann Gutenberg is a person who is both world famous and obscure. In 2000, Time magazine named him Man of the Millennium, as did several other media sources that year. And in the year 2000, you just automatically said man. His qualification was that he invented printing. That is, he invented the European system of typography. And yes, Gutenberg was this person. He really did invent printing. There are no other candidates, and people at the time recognized this. On the other hand, his human essence is obscure, for we have no writing by him or anyone who knew him that expresses it. We know incomparably more about the personalities of some people who lived 1,000+ years before him, say St. Jerome or St. Augustine, or earlier the Apostle Paul, and earlier still Cicero. We understand Gutenberg best through the books he printed, and then there's the added complication that his name does not appear in any book. To put the Mainz Catholicon in context, excuse me, I'm going to do a couple of things here at once. This is what the Mainz Catholicon looks like, not the copy here at Illinois, but a copy at the Bridwell Library at Southern Methodist. Very beautiful copy. To put the Mainz Catholicon in context, we need to make a quick survey of the European printing world from about 1450 to 1460, the year the colophon appeared ready for sale in many dozens of copies. Perhaps the earliest surviving piece of European printing is this fragment of less than a full paper leaf containing the text of a 14th century German prophetic work in rhymed couplets known as the Sibyllenbuch. And this leaf, fragment of leaf, was once used as a wrapper on some document. It came to light in the city of Mainz in the year 1892. Its type is a primitive, clearly imperfect version of Gutenberg's first type, commonly called the DK type, the Donatus and Calendar type. I think you can see how unfinished it is as a printing type. Several editions of an elementary Latin grammar called Donatus were also printed with the same type in this same very imperfect state, and these two survive only as fragments of binding waste. A plausible but unverifiable date for this group is around 1452, and maybe even as early as around 1450. The same DK type, but now in a very well finished state, was used along with a smaller text type in October 1454 to print a papal indulgence for the defense of the island of Cyprus against the Turks. Copies of this indulgence that you see here, originally printed in hundreds or even thousands of copies, are the earliest precisely datable examples of Gutenberg's printing. And here is a close-up of its very handsome, smaller text type. At the same time this indulgence was being printed, Gutenberg was also printing, financed by a Mainz citizen named Johann Fust, a massive Latin Bible, what we call the Gutenberg Bible, though really a better name for it would be the Gutenberg Fust Bible. And this is the fragment, substantial fragment here, not far away from you, here at Illinois, of the book of Genesis. And this shows the type in its very early, extremely clean state. And the Gutenberg Bible used a different and superior Gothic type to Gutenberg's DK type. It's a little bit smaller. It was printed, the Bible was printed in double columns of 40 to 42 lines to the page. The Gutenberg Bible was printed on large paper, the size was called royal, and about 1/4 of the copies were printed on more expensive vellum. A complete copy would be bound in 2 volumes with a total of 640 plus leaves. Gutenberg's partnership with Fust broke up in late 1455, with Fust taking possession of the types and of all the unsold sheets of the Bible. And meanwhile, Gutenberg continued to print in his own smaller shop using his DK type. For instance, in this pamphlet, uniquely surviving in the Scheide Library in Princeton, the Calixtus Bull, Bulla Turcorum, a bull of Pope Calixtus, calling for various penitential responses from Christians in Europe that were to strengthen them in their opposition to the Turkish invasion of Europe. After the Gutenberg Bible, Johann Fust and his servant Peter Schiffer set up their own printing shop, and they began printing books of extraordinary quality. The first being a Psalter, completed in August 1457, using 2 magnificent Gothic textura fonts and beautiful printed initials in 2 colors. For Gutenberg, the apparent final undertaking he made before he turned to producing the Mainz Catholicon was creating a new and very extensive casting of his DK type, which he sold to a printer, Albrecht Pfister, in Bamberg, which is about 120 miles due east of Mainz along the River Main. And Pfister used it to produce a Latin Bible. You see the beginning of it here in Principio, under the patronage of the Bishop of Bamberg. This Bible, now a very rare, the only substantial copy in America is in the Scheide Library, was printed in double columns of 36 lines per page. And having a larger type, fewer lines per page, a complete copy requires 884 leaves. Now, one more book ought to be mentioned in this bird's eye glide over the earliest years of European printing. And that is the first book printed in Strasbourg, which is just 100 miles south of Mainz along the river Rhine. We'll just take a quick look here. Gutenberg, born in Mainz about 1400, lived in exile in Strasbourg for about 15 years, from roughly 1430 to 1445, and he returned to Mainz in the late 1440s. His name appears in various Strasbourg documents. The first book printed in Strasbourg was again a Latin Bible, and you can see in Principio, etc. Although it's anonymous and without a printed date, we know it was produced by an episcopal official, Johann Mentelin, and he completed in or not after 1460, and so it's precisely contemporary with the Catholicon of Gutenberg. Then in the late 1450s, Gutenberg began his new project of printing, the goal being an edition of this 13th century Latin dictionary and grammatical treatise called the Catholicon. It had been compiled by a Dominican of Genoa, Johannes Balbus, or Giovanni Balbi, who recorded piously that he finished writing it on the 7th of March, 1286, and it was a standard Latin dictionary of the late Middle Ages. It's a massive text. This is not the Catholicon, 1/3 longer than the Bible. And so to keep the edition to a reasonable bulk, Gutenberg devised a small, simple rotunda type, the smallest type font so far made. And we see it here from the unique copy of another indulgence for reparation of a destroyed church in Worms, printed in 1462. This is valuable because it was printed with the Catholicon type, but from movable types. And so we see the type more clearly and cleanly in this indulgence than we do in any other printing. Now, using this small type, Gutenberg was able to set double pages of double columns of 66 lines, so that although the Catholicon is 1/3 longer in text than the Latin Bible, a copy consists of only 373 leaves of royal paper, somewhat larger than just a single volume of the Gutenberg Bible. In the 18th century, when European bibliophiles began to pay serious attention to collecting 15th century printed books, the Mainz Catholicon was a well-known early monument, and even then it was strongly supposed that Gutenberg had been its printer. The Catholicon has a colophon, that is, a statement added by the printer at the end of the book. It states explicitly that the book was completed in Mainz in the year 1460, and we have the red arrow pointing to, you see in the middle there, the words Anis, and then M for 1,000, 4 C's for 460, LX. This colophon is in its character in striking contrast to the colophons of the books printed by the other Mainz shop, Fust and Schiffer. Fust and Schiffer featured their own names prominently and proudly. The Catholicon printer, by contrast, remained anonymous, according instead highest praise to the grace of God. I and others have seen in this an expression of Gutenberg's outlook on his own invention, that he had been granted a divine gift, better honored by personal silence than by intruding his unworthy name. We must pause here to consider, what is printing? That is, what is or was European typography in its earliest forms? At the end of the 15th century, a woodcut in a Danse Macabre printed in Lyon provides the first crude depiction of a printing shop. This is a book that survives on only 2 copies, one of which is in the Scheide Library. I'm going to be bragging about the Scheide Library repeatedly, perhaps. In the press room, we see 3 workers. There's a compositor at a desk setting type. There's a pressman about to pull the bar of the printing press, and there's a young boy holding an ink ball, which is used to ink the type page. None of them looks particularly happy. And these represent about half of the process of printing. Gutenberg's invention consisted of the manufacture in cast metal of hundreds of rectangular solids bearing on their ends the reverse image of individual letters or abbreviation characters. These are actual 15th century types, the only 15th century types surviving. They were discovered in river mud in the city of Lyon in the later 19th century. A couple of hundred of them, most of them are at the Bibliothèque Nationale, others are at the Museum of Printing at Lyon, and then there's this group of, I think it's 24, that Princeton acquired a year or so ago. So you see that this is what those physical objects are by which you made printed books. And that scale on the right shows their various heights because these represent different fonts of type, maybe even more than one press, but they're roughly 1 inch tall. To set a page of text in type, you would need multiple, more or less identical types of any given letter, say E or A or T, and the more common a letter, the more types of it you would need. The formal Gothic script that the earliest types were based on had a large number of special characters and abbreviations. Thus, an entire case of, say, the Gutenberg Bible type would need well over 200 compartments, one for each of those individual character forms. So boxes for the common letters, like the vowels and S, T, and D, and so forth, would need well over 100, maybe 200 or more types to go into that box. For uncommon letters, say a capital Z, you might need only a few types in a box, and you might not need it at all in setting most pages. The compositor, and here are you can see the letter forms that stand at the top of those pieces of Lyon type. The compositor, standing at a case of type, would assemble lines of text by drawing out the correct characters in order, one by one from their respective boxes, as this clever diagram that is at the top, which is made by a Spanish scholar, Luz Maria Rangel Alanis, shows. The types, with reverse pictures of the letters on their tops, were set from right to left, including short spacer or quad types used to separate words. So when you see a printed book, a type printed book with spaces between the words, physically that's not empty space. There are also pieces of type, but they're shorter, so they don't take ink. They don't have any letter forms on top of them. When a full page of type was assembled, it was locked tightly into what is called a form by blocking all sides with wooden slats that fit into a metal frame, using wedges to tighten up the hole so firmly that the form could be picked up and moved without any of the individual types coming loose and falling out. This form was inked, paper was laid over it, and the platen of the press, a plate of the press, pushed the paper into the ink types, producing a printed page of text. The form was then re-inked, another piece of paper laid over it, printed again, the platen pulled down again, producing a second copy of that exact text, and so on up to 200 or 300 or as many copies as were needed. So, of course, it took quite a bit of time to set and lock up the types for that page of text. And a scribe might be able to write out that same page in even shorter time. But once the form was ready for printing, multiple copies could be made very rapidly, one after another, less than a minute apart, like a repeating rifle, soon overpassing by 100-fold or more the speeds that scribes could achieve. And to viewers of printed books at the time, the speed of printing was something that seemed miraculous. This schematic at the top shows the types needed to set just 4 lines of one column of the Gutenberg Bible. And we see below it what was printed from those notional types. The total number of types needed to set a full page of the Bible would be close to 3,000. And so the type case would have to contain, in varying proportions according to which letters they are, well over 3,000 types. Now, our slide represents just a thin sliver of time. We're looking at the labor of one compositor working for, say, 5 minutes or so to compose 4 lines of the Latin Bible, of the book of Genesis in this case. It does not capture the longer-term dynamic, which defines the typographic printing as a continuous process. The fundamental concept of European printing, and thus the elegance of Gutenberg's invention, is represented by another schematic, the typographic cycle. This is my terrible little sketch, is the typographic cycle. And this really is the kernel of what typographic printing means. At the top, we have a type case, and we picture a compositor standing at that case. He's copying from a manuscript, say, setting out the text, just as we saw on the slide before. Sets up lines of types. The lines of types then go to an imposition table. This is really the critical stage where those lines of types are arranged together into what makes up an entire page of printing. You might have to make adjustments. You might have to make an indentation here or there. And then you have to lock it into the form very tightly. And then that form goes to the press, and you see the form down there at the bottom. The press over it, a bar attached to a screw, an iron plate. The platen is suspended below that screw. It's pulled down over the press, And then you have, notionally, white paper coming up to the press, being put over the ink type, pulled down, pressed, and then printed paper coming out the other side. And eventually you do that over and over again. You have a book, and you print as many copies of that page, say 200, and then the next page, and the next page, and the next page. And then what makes it a cycle is what happens on the right-hand side, where I've just written the word distribution. And that takes just about as long as the left half does. And that is, when you're done printing, the page is still in the form, you loosen the form, you might scrub the type with lye to remove excess ink, and then every one of those characters has to go back into the typecase, and it has to go into the right box in the typecase. And that is what keeps the cycle going. And of course, sometimes the person distributing the type, who might be an apprentice, would put them in the wrong box. And then the compositor setting would pull the wrong type out of that box. And those types were sometimes called foul case. And so a word can come out that just is completely the wrong letter. And theoretically, when you proof, you will find those, but nobody ever proofs a book perfectly, so they will show up. Now, obviously, the second half of the cycle is the critical stage in my mind. Obviously, the same piece of type cannot appear twice on the same page. You reach into the box once, say it's a letter E. Later, you pull out another E, but it's not the same piece of type. But if the type appears on one page, it then gets distributed back to the typecase. And so then it can appear on a second page or third page of the same book, because later it's back in the box again, and later the compositor pulls it out again. And you can have the same type, and they show up, especially when they're damaged, on another page. And so here we have two examples of the DK type in the Calixtus bowl in the Scheide Library that are damaged, but they have two different pieces of damage on the right arm of that letter U with a stroke above. And so the one above appears like on 2 recto, the 14th line, went back into the box, and then 3 recto, the compositor reached into the box again and he pulled it out. And of course, he wasn't looking to see, is this damaged or not? He just put it in the right place. Went back into the box, 6 recto, the hand reached in, found it again, 7 verso, found it again. And the same with the other damaged character, another actual physical piece of type with a notch, got knocked up against something. And again, it appears 3 times. Now we can turn to the Mainz Catholicon of 1460 and to 2 other small pamphlets that were also printed with the type and in the same way. And one is a little pamphlet by St. Thomas Aquinas. This Aquinas tract is a very unusual book. It's the only edition known in which some copies, the one you see on the left, which are quite rare, no copy in America, have 36 lines per page, and the others, of which there are a number of copies in America, have 34 lines, but they are absolutely identical typesetting. And then the other small tract, printed the same way as the Catholicon, is this by Matthew of Krakow, a late medieval theologian. And this has only 30 lines to the page because there's wider spacing between the lines. So in this quick bird's eye view of earliest printing, we have looked at 8 items, both books and broadsides, printed with movable type, that is, all according to Gutenberg's first invention, all following the typographic cycle. My claim has been that the 3 Catholicon press books are completely different from this. They were printed by another method, and this method was Gutenberg's second invention. By the end of the 15th century, this had been forgotten, and it lay hidden from sight, and yet it's been in plain sight for well over 500 years, say from about 1460 to 1982. And the second invention was the earliest version of what we would now call stereotyping, printing from solid blocks. In Gutenberg's shop, the system would have been this. First, a text, say the lines of the Catholicon, were set in type, a certain number of lines. And next, a proof was printed. So now we're dealing with movable type, for instance, by lightly inking it and pressing paper over it. And this text then was carefully examined by a corrector. That is, it was proofread against the original, which would have been a manuscript, because this is the first printing, from which the compositor had been copying. And any errors found were corrected by taking out and replacing the types that were wrong. No such proofs survive, and proofs from any early printing are extremely rare, because once the proofs had been used, they became waste paper and were discarded. But we do know that there was a proofreading stage, because the massive Mainz Catholicon contains remarkably few typographic errors, such as misspelled or dropped words. About a half hour ago, I found one typographic error while looking at the Illinois copy, and I quickly paused and wrote down a little note to myself. Here's another typographic error, because we don't have very many, and it's just that they set one extra letter in one word. So the text of the Mainz Catholicon is actually more accurate in this sense than that of the Gutenberg Bible. And then after proofing, what I say happened was the lines of composed type were gathered in firmly secured pairs and pressed down into, and this is a guess, but it can be done, fine sand, which held the exact impression of the letter forms of those two lines of type. And then type metal was poured over these temporary matrices, as we call them, resulting in thin two-line strips of metal whose upper side held the same image as the types did. And it is these thin two-line strips which were gathered into columns and pages and used to print the Catholicon and the two small quartos. Then, after being printed from, the two-line strips were stored and could be rapidly reassembled to be printed from again, as did happen with all three books. Now, I admit this is an unexpected thing to claim about a group of books more than 500 years old, which up until 1982 had been treated as ordinary old books, that is, set from movable type. And somebody might say, well, why am I saying such a thing? And my answer would be, because this meets the evidence, and because it can be tested and disproved if wrong. And a good hypothesis also contains a potential disproof. If your hypothesis is so vague that you never have to say, no, I'm wrong, you haven't really hypothesized anything. We know the three Catholicon press books are a problem because of the paper stocks they were printed on. 15th century paper was made at vats containing thick, soupy suspensions in water of fine linen and hemp fibers, broken down by a system of rotting and hammering that is using a paper mill is a set of large hammers that pound away at old rags and rope. And then wire mesh molds of distinct sizes would be dipped into the vat. Actually, the process used two molds in succession to make one stock of paper. And these molds typically had small wire images sewn to part of their surface, creating watermarks, which you're looking at here. Images visible when you hold the light up to the light because the paper is thinner. And these were the distinct marks of the various paper makers. And as I said, like the Gutenberg Bible, the Catholicon was printed on paper the size called royal, which means a large copy, hardly trimmed, would measure about 16 inches tall and about 11.5 inches wide. It has been known for well over 100 years, since about 1905, that all the surviving copies of the Catholicon divide into three groups, as you see here. Some copies were printed on a paper with a bull's head watermark. Some, right there, on paper with a house mark of the Galiziani paper mill in Basel. Looks like a letter D, or it might be a backward C, with a surmount of a cross on top. And some on a mixture of two different stocks, one watermarked with the tower, as you see, and the other with the crown. And we further know that each set of copies was printed on its own printing press, or maybe pair of presses. And we know that the vellum copies that I've mentioned were printed on the same press as the bull's head copies. Now, the Mainz Catholicon is the only early printed book that has this feature of division into distinct issues defined by their respective papers. And we will just look. Here are three copies in America, one of each impression. The one on the left is a vellum, same press as the bull's head press at the Scheide Library at Yale. The one in the middle here is this Illinois Galiziani copy. The one on the right is a copy of the Tower Crown impression, copy in the Scheide Library. This was an unexplained curiosity, this division into paper stocks. But no one thought it was a problem until the late 1960s, when a German paper historian, Theo Gerardi, realized that each of the three paper groups belonged to separate time periods. This is what Gerardi found out. 1460, 1469, and 1472 to 73. That is, the bull's head paper existed in 1460. That's the date which is printed in the Catholicon. But the other two paper groups were not made until years later. They did not exist in 1460. Therefore, they could not have been printed in 1460. And this slide summarizes the problem, and it is a problem that cannot be explained away. Although I can say from my own memory that in the 1970s and early 1980s, most scholars of early printing, known as incunabulists, didn't realize or internalize this. They thought there must be something wrong with the paper evidence. Then in 1981, a second German paper historian, Eva Zischer, in Berlin, went over Gerardi's work even more thoroughly and found additional evidence that his datings were correct. She even refined the dates to what the dates we see here. And then I went over Zischer's evidence, and both Gerardi and Zischer shared all their evidence with me. That's the way research is supposed to work. And I found even more verification that the respective dates of manufacture of the papers are as given in this slide. And a few years later, Gerardi also studied the paper of the two Catholicon-type quartos, the Aquinas and Matthew of Krakow tractates, and found the same kind of contradiction. And in those 36-line Aquinas, he found they're printed on paper, such as you see here, that he found in various other documents, in particular dated from about 1458 to 1460. But the 34-line Aquinas and all the copies he looked at Matthew were printed on this other bull's head paper. You see he has a kind of ring in his forehead. So again, you have a kind of a contradiction. When were these books printed? The world of early printing owes a great debt to the modest amateur paper historian Theo Gerardi, who died in 1986. He forced us all to encounter a deep paradox from the first years of printing. Yet while he was alive, he received scant recognition from the grandees of the German book world. They were not experienced in considering paper as evidence and were complacent in thinking that there must be something wrong with the evidence rather than with themselves. I thought a lot about the Catholicon problem at the beginning of 1982. I knew to certainty that Gherardi and Sciascia were right about the dates of the different paper stocks, but had no idea how a book could have been printed apparently identically at 3 different times. One evening in February of that year, I was sitting, alone in a somewhat rundown brownstone in Brooklyn. And I wrote down on index cards scattered data about the 3 Catholicon Press books, and I shuffled them around, a little bit like playing solitaire. One thing I noted more actively than before was what we still have up on screen, copies of the Aquinas tract, either 36 or 34 lines to the page, but only the rare 36-line copies were printed up on paper that existed in 1460. And then another minor datum was a random accident found in some copies, the Galiziani impression of the Catholicon, including the one here at Illinois, in which 2 lines of text were stuck into the column upside down, which you certainly don't see in any other early printed books. But in other copies, such as the one in Berlin below, they're in the right order. So we have things happening by pairs of lines, which seem to be integral. And the copies on bull's head and vellum paper have another kind of an accident, where 2 pairs of lines are switched around, so the textual order is all wrong. And so the reader of this copy wrote little A's, B's, C's, and D's to tell you how to read. So you end the line A, marked A with P-O-L, and then you pop down to the A a couple lines below on the left to licus. Paulicus is the single word genitive of pollex, meaning thumb, and so on and so forth. I had been aware of all these oddities before, but on this particular evening, 2 brain cells rubbed together to make a spark. And finally, I had an idea. The printing units of the Catholicon Press were not individual types, but castings of 2-line pairs. And if this was true, every inconsistency or variation in any copy of any of the 3 books had to manifest in 2-line units. And in particular, if in a given line of the Catholicon, a few characters appear to be different between 2 copies, it will turn out it's absolutely necessary that both lines of the pair will have been entirely reset. In ordinary printing, it is possible to stop printing, loosen the lines, take out one or more types and replace them with others, then tighten the lines up again and continue printing. This was the usual way of making corrections from the earliest printing, the Gutenberg Bible, onward, and we find it in the Gutenberg Bible. Every early Mainz book that survives in multiple copies contains examples of this kind of type-by-type resetting. The Catholicon Press books, I say, do not, and this strict rule of my explanation has never been violated up until at least today, October, whatever, 2025. My claim is and was that the Catholicon was first printed from assemblages of 2-line strips in 1460, as stated in its colophon, on paper that existed in 1460. In fact, it's the exact same paper on which Johann Mentelin in Strasbourg printed his Latin Bible, which was finished not after 1460. That then the strips were stored. Then in 1469, about a year after Gutenberg's death, the strips were assembled again to print a second impression of the Catholicon using paper with the Galiziani watermark, which existed in 1469, and the Illinois copy belongs to this impression. And then in 1472 or 73, the strips were assembled a third time and printed from using 2 more paper stocks with Tower, Crown watermarks, which existed in those years and not earlier. So this hypothesis had to pass a number of tests. The first one was that there needed to be evidence that the 1460 paper impression really did precede the 1469 paper impression. And the 1469 paper impression had to precede the 1472 paper impression. My hypothesis has passed this test on the basis of several accidents that, first happened in 1469 or never appear in 1460, and then happening in 1469, they have to happen again because the strips are used again in 1472-73. And in fact, that very evening that I formulated my hypothesis, I wrote down a test that it ought to satisfy. When Theo Gherardi studied the papers of the two quartos, this is what he found. 36-line Aquinas on late 1450 papers, but all the Matthew of Krakow copies he saw were printed on the paper of the late 1460s, same as 34-line Aquinas. I thought this did not make sense. Some copies of the Matthew tract ought also to have been printed on late 1450s paper in parallel with the Aquinas. Now, the Morgan Library, where I then worked, owned a copy of the Matthew, but it was also in late 1460s paper. So I have a hypothesis, and it's not working. So I went in search of other copies. And my first try was to take a bus to Princeton. This was Port Authority in the days that if you've seen Midnight Cowboy, you know what it was like in that part of New York City. But I plugged away through there, got a ticket, suburban bus lines, and looked at the copy in the Scheide Library, having no idea I would later be working in the Scheide Library. And success. This copy was printed on the same paper as the 36-line Aquinas. So there were two impressions of Matthew a decade apart, just as there were of Aquinas and just as I predicted. And we found more copies of the Matthew on the early paper and with pinholes showing that it was printed on the same press as the 36-line Aquinas. And then I also found evidence of the paired line unity of the Catholicon press books that I had not been expecting. New York Public Library owns two copies of the Catholicon, one printed on Galiziani paper, 1469, one on Tower Crown, 1472. I went to their rare book room and looked at them side by side, and soon, really quickly, found a number of cases where the lateral position of particular line pairs varied between the two copies, like this. Like in one copy, one impression, the line pairs match up. In another, the pair of lines shifts to left or right. But there's no movement within the lines. They move together as a unit, which, of course, if they were cast, they have to. As I looked at more copies of all three of the Catholicon press books, I found that such shifts of line pairs were everywhere. And they never violated my rule that the two lines had to be an odd-numbered line followed by an even-numbered line, starting at the top, lines 1 and 2, then 3 and 4 is the second pair, never the other way around. In the world of early printing, various scholars were unready to accept my hypothesis. This is as it should be. We should not publish an argument unless we are ready for it to be tested. Often one can become captive to one's own theory, unable to see alternatives that other doubting minds may see. Still, I thought the foundation of my hypothesis was pretty clear: an absolute lack of movement of characters within line pairs. That is the foundation. Well, as it happened, my hypothesis was challenged in 1989 by an eminent scholar of early printing, Lotte Hellinga, who proposed an alternative explanation that did not challenge my hypothesis, but rather sidestepped it. Her idea was that the Catholicon press books were printed from movable types, but that the three impressions, distinguished by the papers, had all been produced in 1469. And so the idea is roughly this: the bull's head paper, maybe some reams, sat around for 9 years. 1469 Galiziani paper, everything is right. 1469 does make sense. The Tower Crown papers, there was an argument by Dr. Hellinga that maybe they existed a couple of years earlier. Now, The Tower Crown paper did not exist a couple of years later, but I can't go into the evidence for that because it really requires a separate lecture about the use of royal paper in printing shops in Europe in the 1460s, 70s. But for the sake of argument, let's say that maybe they did exist in 1470. So by this picture, there was a shop in Mainz and had 3 printing presses in it, and each press with a different pinhole setup, and each was under the control of a printer or publisher who guarded his own paper supply jealously. And so type pages were first printed at the Bull's Head press, and then they moved over to the Galiziani press, and finally to the Tower Crown press, after which the pages were broken up and the individual letters making up the pages were distributed back to the boxes of the type case. And the fact that the order of printing followed the chronological order of the paper stocks was just a coincidence. Didn't have to be that way, but Dr. Hellinger and others thought, well, it could be, therefore let's say it was. And what about the undeniable 2-line units of printing? How by this thesis does one account for them, which produce such oddities as those we've already seen, like the misarranged line pairs and the upside-down pair of lines? Another book scholar in London, my doubters seem to reside in Great Britain above all, suggested that every 2 lines of type had been tied up with thread or wire to consolidate them as a block, and that the rationale was this helped prevent accidents when the type pages were moved from one press to the next. Over time, James firmed up his idea. What started as thread or wire became just wire. It became clear you needed something very strong to keep the types from shifting. And then it became wire pulled through holes drilled in the sides of the types, which I guess made it even firmer. And the final version was, yeah, you had holes drilled in the sides of the type, you tied them up with wire, and the ink was especially sticky, and that helped keep the pieces of type together. And all this was to try to explain with movable type what my 2-line stereostrips absolutely requires, the lack of movement of letters within the line pairs. And, by the way, I consider this whole suggestion to be a solution in search of a problem. Look again at the typographic cycle and consider its physical reality in a printing shop. And here we see the imposition table, we see the printing press, both as sketchy as can be. If a form of type can be moved at roughly waist height from the imposing table to the press, as it happened hundreds and thousands of times in every printing shop, then there would be no particular problem in moving that same form from one press to another. Nothing so complicated as to require tightly wiring up line pairs, drilling holes through the sides, etc., because it's the same physical operation. You're moving a page of type, a form of type, from point A at height X, let's say waist height, to point B, another press, at the same height, X, waist height. There is no problem. There's another flaw with the argument of lines of type, movable type tied together with wire. It does not explain that most conspicuous feature of the Catholicon press, which we've seen, the many cases of lateral shifting of line pairs from one copy to another. Because if these were paired lines of movable type, they could not shift horizontally to right and left, because they would be tightly locked in place by the side sticks of the form, running up and down the sides. There's no wiggle room. These competing explanations, mine of 2-line strips, Dr. Hellinger's of movable type printing, led to a considerable amount of controversy in the next years. And we can't review every claim, some of which travel down some very obscure pathways. But I do want to emphasize that the evidence that the Bull's Head and vellum copies of the Catholicon were printed in 1460 and not 1469 is really strong, and for 2 reasons. First, the bull's head paper definitely existed in 1460. And 1460 is the date in the Catholicon. You can't just throw away that date. Dr. Hellinger argued that that rare phrase annis, 1460, instead of the much more common anno, as we say anno domini, could be interpreted to mean in the years ending in 60, therefore arriving at 1469. But there are numerous other colophons, both scribal and in printing shops, that use this formula annis. I've searched out dozens of them, being led to this by the remark of a great paleographer, Albert Derlet. And every one contradicts this, every single one. It is clear that for 15th century writers of Latin, annis meant the same thing as anno, that is, in the year X. And moreover, Dr. Hellinger maintained that a distinguished German classical philologist, Hildebrecht Hummel, had supported her interpretation of the years ending in 60, but in fact, Hummel argued the precise opposite. So that's not good form. Second, there is a copy of the Catholicon with an inscription bracketed there recording its purchase by the provost of a convent in early June 1465. This copy is in Gotha, Germany. Here we have a test. By my explanation, the copy absolutely has to have been printed either on bull's head paper or in vellum. By Hellinger's explanation, it's just a wrong date, and it could be on any of the three impressions. But yes, indeed, it is a bull's head copy. So what would have overthrown my hypothesis supports it. So even if you think the Catholicon was printed with movable type, there is overwhelming evidence that the bull's head and vellum copies were printed in 1460. So you can't make a consensus argument for 1469. Now, decades ago, I thought I'd said everything I had to say about the Mainz Catholicon. Fundamentally, I do not believe that the Catholicon books were printed from movable type, not just because the arguments for it have been guesswork, the result of motivated reasoning, but also because they are purely reactive. They predict nothing, only try to explain away phenomena that are already known. Whereas my explanation is predictive, a series of phenomena not known in 1982 all have turned out to satisfy the requirements of the explanation. Moreover, this coin of being predictive has its other side. The theory is disverifiable. Its absolute requirement is that within any pair of odd plus even lines, there can be no visible movement of the letter shapes whatsoever. That is, you will not find in the Catholicon press books what you find incessantly in books printed from movable type. And that is small shifts in position of a letter or letters, the result of slight looseness in the printing forms, like this one in the Gutenberg Bible. In the upper, you see the copy in the Gutenberg Museum in Mainz. And if you look at that word dixerunt, the last word, you see that the R is floating a little bit above the E. And then if you look at the copy in the Scheide Library, you see that the R has moved down, so it lines up with the E. And my colleague Eric White made this overlay of the two, and if you have sharp eyes, you can see that there are two different positions of the letter R in the two copies. This is what happens all the time in books printed from movable type. Never, I say, in the Catholicon, unless you can find an example, but it hasn't happened yet. But then, a year ago, Mr. Farley Katz published an article that directly challenged my claim that there is no movement of letter forms. He argued, with many real illustrations, that although the letter shapes might not move, the spacers or quads between the words did so. Let's look here. This is just one picture of three copies of the Catholicon, spaced between two words, close up. He said that those spacers could move up or down, specifically, so that in one copy they might leave no ink impression or a very slight impression. In another copy, there would be more inking, and so there was variation. Now, these non-printing quads only reach to shoulder height of the type, that is, the short of the taller face of the letter form, which projects above the shoulder like a mesa. And so, in principle, that's right. The tops of the quads should not be touched by the ink balls. But if you're printing with movable type, and if the form is a little loose, it's true, those quads can rise up and take some ink. And there are many such variably inked quads in the Catholicon. And Mr. Katz saw these as a positive disproof of the two-line stereo theory. And this is well worth discussion. But I'm not convinced that what Mr. Katz documented was caused by rising or raised quads, which work themselves up in forms of movable type. I believe that the same effect of partial and variant inking of quads could occur with two-line stereo strips, due to variations such as the depth of push of the ink balls from one inking to another. And in general, type pages in early printing in early printed books from movable type can and do show a great deal of variation in inking from one copy to another, even one page to another when you have two different copies. But the good thing about our disagreement is that it can be tested. Consider, if that quad inking, we see variations here in this one example, if that is the result of movable types, it is because the forms loosened, decreasing the friction on their sides caused by their tight fit in the line. The letters abutting them moved apart a little bit, so they could move up. Therefore, if the forms were loose, there should be some change in distance, however small, between the two types on either side of the quads. If the quads can move upward along the z-axis, according to Cartesian coordinates, they ought also to be able to move along the x-axis, that is, right and left along the line they are in, or along the y-axis, up and down within the line, as in that Gutenberg Bible moving type we saw, the letter R. Or a little bit on the x-axis and a little bit on the y-axis, taking you back to middle school arithmetic or mathematics or the beginnings of algebra. In fact, these movements should be more common, for they do not have to overcome the downward pull of gravity. And moreover, if non-printing quads can move because of loose forms, so can all the other, much more numerous types bearing letter forms on their faces. All types are equal, we might say. They are all rectangular solids of metal. Thus, somewhere in the massive Catholicon, 1/3 longer in text than the Bible, we should be able to find at least a few examples of small shifts in the position of single types. Whereas my theory requires that if a character within a two-line strip is out of place, it stays out of place permanently in every copy because it was already out of place when that strip was cast. Take the letter X, this word saxorum. It appears to hover above the line with respect to the A and the O on the two sides of it. If any movement of letters can ever be found in the Catholicon Press books, my theory will be wrong, but it hasn't happened yet. But I'm doubly grateful to Mr. Katz. First, he raised a real, interesting, and most of all testable question. Second, he inspired me to start examining closely again the physical impressions of the Catholicon Press books, the ink marks upon paper, something I hadn't done in decades. My friend and colleague, Eric White in Princeton, also began close examination, and we consulted another book expert, a good friend of mine, Dr. Nick Wilding. And one day, it was last spring, I noticed an oddity that appeared in all three impressions of the Catholicon. that B in the letter ob has a thing on it, a blob. And I didn't understand that blob. It seems to have attached itself to the B, and it never went away. Therefore, it was not a random inking error created when one particular page was inked for printing. It was physically attached to the letter B. And here, copies of 3 different impressions. They all have the B. You also see that the A of Ulster by the 3rd printing, Tower Crown, is getting squashed, deformed to a degree. Then, a couple days later, Eric noticed a similar blob on another page. He has very sharp eyes, sharper than I do. And that is this word invenunter. And in the vellum copy, the I, U are normal, but in the Scheide copy on Tower Crown paper, there's a big, round, black blob between the I and the U. Now, this one didn't appear in Bull's Head, only in Galiziani and Tower Crown. So I just didn't know what these blobs were. I knew they were something, but I emailed pictures with Nick Wilding. And a couple of days later, Nick sent an email back saying, "What about nail heads?" And this was an inspired suggestion. I really, as soon as he said it, I thought, yeah, that's right. And so Eric and I started looking, and we quickly decided we were going to look at every page of the Catholicon in multiple copies. Digitizations makes this much easier, dividing the work between us. And I cropped out images of every prospective nailhead we found. So the total that we have found, like these blobs, comes to well over 1,100. Now, these black ink images, we're calling them nailheads. They are not random splotches on the pages. In every case, it's clear that they were intentionally placed, and the idea was they wouldn't interfere with reading the text. And so you see 3 examples here. One, that in the first one, the word in, capital I-N, the I has a blob right in the middle. So it's like a special form of I, but you know it's an I. The second one, a workman put the nail right in the bowl of the O of corripient, and in this case, hammered it so hard that you don't see the O anymore, but you just see the nailhead. And in the third one, it's between the I and the ST. And where you don't want to put them is between 2 words, because then it looks like a punctuation mark, and then you can't read the text properly. And every once in a while, there's a mistake, but they're incredibly rare. And thanks to a remarkable photographic system in the digital lab of Princeton University Library, we can verify that these blobs or nailheads are 3-dimensional solids because they press into the pages just as the letter forms do. And in many cases, they are higher on the printing surface than the letter shapes. This system is called the Selene photometric stereo system, developed by Spanish computer technologists. And these images were taken by the head of digital services at Princeton, Roel Munoz, very accomplished, very good photographer. Person you go to with one problem after another, and he always has an idea. Now, what we're looking at here is just the final word on a line in the Aquinas tract, the word out, A-U-T. And on the left is the 36-line Aquinas, and you see out is normal, and that's printed on paper of 1460. On the right, you see that same word in 34-line Aquinas, printed on paper of 1469, and between the U and T, there is a big blob, which really deforms the T, blocks out most of the U. The Selene system, well, here we see a close-up of it, and then the Selene system is able to translate that into 3D of the paper surface. And so you see that that big blob is pushing into the paper even further than the U and the T. Now, so obviously the 36-line impression that doesn't have the accent was printed before the 34-line impression. You cannot explain this with movable type. Just you don't hammer things into pages of movable type. It just doesn't happen. There's no equivalent. And then early this past summer, Eric was in Krakow, and he had time to look at the copy of the Catholicon in the Jagiellonian Library. Wonderful, one of the great libraries of Europe. And just really by chance, he noticed on one page what we think must be an impression of an actual loose nail lying on its side that fell onto the page at that point. And it got inked and printed and gives us an outline of its true shape. And it really does look like a nail with a pointed end. These hundreds of nail heads prove that the Catholicon books were not printed from movable types. There would be no reason to hammer nails into a form of movable type. If you did so, of course the nail would push the types apart, which is precisely what does not happen with the Catholicon books. So, coming up to the end, we see the printing process as follows. The printing surface of each page was an assemblage of two-line stereocastings, thin strips. And these strips would have been attached by adhesive, say resin, to bases, probably of thin wood. And there is a 16th century large woodcut map which actually has such stereocastings used to print captions on the map. This is in Bavaria. In the course of printing, under pressure from successive pulls of the platen, some of the strips began to come loose from their bases. They didn't stick down. If and when that happened, the printing would be paused, the page would be pulled out from under the platen, and a nail or tack, for many of them are quite small, would be driven into the strip to hold it down more firmly. And then every subsequent impression of that page would, of course, show the nail head. And this establishes a chronological imperative, which has been obeyed by every nail head we have identified. The imperative is that if a nail head is recorded in at least one copy of the bull's head vellum impression, that's in 1460, it has to appear in every copy of the Glitziani impression in 1469, and it has to appear in every copy of the Tower Crown impression in 1472 or 73. Likewise, if it is absent in the bull's head impression, but appears in at least one copy of the Glitziani impression, then it must appear in every single copy of the Tower Crown impression. Once a nail is added, it does not go away. And in fact, we can see more broadly how in the second and third impressions, after the strips had been stored for some years, they began to need more repairs to secure them on their bases. The resin may have dried up, been less firm. And one way to measure this is by the number of times the printing of pages was paused for a nail to be added to secure a strip before continuing. When the 1460 bull's head impression was made, 106 of the 745 pages were paused to add a nail. So it's pretty good. You could print a number of pages and everything was right, but about 1 out of every 7 times you did have to secure a strip. 9 years later, when the Glitziani impression was printed, 151 pages had to be paused for adding new nails. So you had to pause more often than you did in 1460. And then, 3 or 4 years later after that, when the Tower and Crown impression was printed, 438 pages had to be paused to add a nail to one or more strips, almost 3/5 of all the pages printed. Press runs were typically not going smoothly at that point from beginning to end. And we see this degradation of the strips, likewise in the progressive wear to the printing surfaces in the successive impressions. Possibly the type metal used to cast them was softer than ordinary type, for by the time of the Tower Crown impression, many of the letter forms seem to get broadened and less sharp. This is just a random example. This isn't maybe the best slide of 2 lines from the Yale vellum copy versus Scheide Tower Crown. And look especially at that first word, Aries, and then I've enlarged them below. And you see that the A gets deformed, that every letter is thickened later on. And this is consistent in both the quartos and the Catholicon itself. And because of this widespread wear, it would not have been feasible to try to print the Catholicon for a 4th time from these strips. And finally, Eric's and my search for nailheads has also brought to light as a kind of bonus a second independent result, which likewise argues strongly, and I would say definitively, against the idea that the Catholicon could have been movable type, and that is miscast line pairs. And consider this close-up images, and this word, actually portion of a word, pillucrum, and look at it in the top line, printed with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 characters. The one that looks like the number R, number 4 stands for RUM, pillucrum. And then look at it 2 lines below. 2 lines below is not movable type. Because they aren't types. Because those cannot be 6 deformed, miscast letters in a row. Because the compositor would have had to have been reaching into the box the exact same way he did 2 lines earlier, and first found a bad P, next, by coincidence, a bad I, next a bad L, next a bad U, next a bad C, and next a bad room. The probability against it is overwhelming. But more than that, they cannot be, because the second pillucrum is narrower than the first. But types are blocks of solid type metal. They cannot shrink in width. Even if there were flaws in the casting, you have to end up with the same width. So this distortion happened rather when the 2-line strip was cast. And what it appears like to me is that when the 2 lines were lifted up out of the sand, the worker twisted the lines a little and disturbed the surface. And here we see 2 line pairs in a row, both of which have, montes, ponunter respicunt. We found at least 8 other miscast line pairs, and their distortion is always in the first letters of the line. And let's see, I think this is a little close-up, which is even better. Yeah. These must result from some distinctive manual error, which is a sort of yip in the hand of one of the workmen. So, we conclude. The Catholicon press books were printed from 2-line stereotype castings, not from movable types. The 1,000+ nail heads that appear in copies of the books provide massive corroboration. So do the miscast line pairs. In the Catholicon press books, we see Gutenberg's second typographic invention, how to print not from movable types, but from stereotypes. Yes, Gutenberg invented printing from movable type, but having done so, he did not stop thinking. Thank you.
Questions?
Well, I probably stunned you into silence. So one person is.
So you mentioned being able to determine which press something was printed on based on the pinholes. How does that work?
Well, I need a diagram. I should have made a handout diagram. But to hold the paper firmly in place in the early years of printing, you put it on it's called a tympan. You had little pins sticking up with sharp points, and you actually press the paper down on it. And those have distinctive patterns. Like in the Gutenberg Bible, at first they used 10 different pinholes. As time went by, they simplified it. And finally, what they ended up with is when you're printing a full sheet, which is like 2 leaves of paper together, and they have the fold in the middle, is you put a pin in the middle and a pin in the middle. And then when you bind the book, the pinholes disappear. And it's only in those very rare occasions that an entire unbound sheet survives, that you can see the pinholes. But that's basically it. And in fact, for these 3 impressions of the Catholicon, yes, the pinhole pattern of 1472 is like the pinhole pattern of other books, including one printed by William Caxton in Cologne in 1472. And they fit the same chronological sequence. But if you believe to your very soul it has to be movable type, you think that's a coincidence also. So,
Makes sense. Thank you.
yeah. Well, I see 2 gentlemen. You and then.
I was gesturing to the fellow in black.
Okay.
Sorry, I have 3 short related questions. First, why 2 lines? Why not a word or 1 line or 3 or 4 lines or a whole page? Second, have you found any of these slugs that
No. I mean, okay, first, why 2 lines? Well, kind of the simple answer is just that's what happened.
Right.
But there is when you're pouring type metal, molten metal, there's a limited area over which you can get a clean pour. And I think that 3 or 4 lines is certainly a full page. Just you cannot do that area of pouring cleanly. So I think maybe that's why 2 lines.
and not words?
And not words, because then to reassemble them, you kind of have to recompose everything. If you've numbered each, like say you have a column of the Catholicon, 66 lines, that's 33 line pairs. Just if you number them on the back in some way, you can put them into correct order very quickly. So, but no, none survive, but virtually no 15th century printing type survives. Just this rare survival of Lyon printers throwing them out the window into the, into the mud of the river, and discovered by scavengers in the 19th century, who were, what they were searching for were little bits of gold that had been thrown out of goldsmiths' shops. And along the way, they turned up these metal types, which wonderfully got preserved and sold and survived.
Okay, one more small thing. Once the slug was made, to make the slug, would they have to assemble it from type to begin with?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
and then if they made the slug, might they redistribute that type back
Oh,
to?
they would. I mean, they
Okay.
absolutely would.
And if there was a defect in a piece of type that showed up in the slug, might that particular character show up?
It
in a different
could, and that is a possibility. I have never been convinced of seeing one, and the reason is that the letter impressions of the slugs, because they're secondary, they're not primary from the type pushing in, they're less clear, they're less sharp. And so I just, it kind of fuzzes up the situation to a degree.
You have actually a missing piece of,
There are a couple of examples of that, and we've made note of them. I don't feel completely confident about them. Gentleman in the back
I would
there?
say gentleman in blue and then colleague in green, and then those will be the last two.
Okay.
Because I want people to actually have time to see
to look
stuff.
at real things, yeah.
I don't know if it would seem a strong reason for making this invention, is it essentially eliminates the distribution step in the printing process that you showed.
Well, I mean, it
makes that step
yeah.
immensely easier.
It could have been done. I mean, we don't know whether, they printed this gigantic book, the Catholicon, 3 different times. They sold copies very successfully in all 3 cases. They kind of reached the limit. Whether at the end of all that, Gutenberg had died before the second impression. His investor, a man named Konrad Humery, must have been, well, we know he took possession of them. We don't know at the end of all that what the profit and loss might have been, but printers didn't pick it up. But then real stereotyping got reinvented a couple of times in later centuries. And in the 19th century, any popular book, the first edition would be printed in stereotype. I mean, just the first thing you did was make a clean stereotype, because then you could, Tom Sawyer, Huckleberry Finn, you could print so many copies in one printing shop. You could sell stereo plates or lend them to another printer, like, in Baltimore, say, and they could print 10,000 more. And studying 19th century books is much more difficult than studying 15th century books because of this, the way things look all the same, but they're really different. They were made in different places by different workers and so forth. They might use slightly different paper supplies, but they all look the same at first. Yeah.
Have you seen any other books that look like they are printed with the same technique?
No. I mean, theoretically, somebody else could have done it, but it's never been found or noticed. I mean, I suspect that this is Gutenberg's invention got lost with his death. Although the general printing smaller stereos did not get lost. It was actually a very easy process, and especially for maps, for printed editions of maps where you have a complicated caption. You could either carve out the letters in wood, the same as the woodblock itself, or you could carve a little channel, and sometimes you could fit movable type into it, but many of them have little stereo strips instead. And so in that area, it continued on into the 16th century, certainly. By the 17th century, the best maps were made by engraving rather than woodcut.
Okay.
Was that?
Paul, one question. What do we know about the height of type as opposed to the height of the face? How thick is the piece of type?
You mean how tall is it?
Yeah.
These Lyon types, they vary quite a bit because they're probably different fonts, and there was no international metric or any other standard, but they're around 1 inch. Some are a little more than, like 2.5 centimeters is an approximate height. Well, there they are.
Okay,
Yeah, I mean, they survive, so they're the primary evidence.
Okay, I want to invite everyone to thank Paul. If you have additional questions, bring him a cookie.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much.